All right, this works for everyone. Great. Good morning. Good to see you. And hopefully it all works out for those who are from afar as well. This presentation, and I should maybe say a couple of words of thanks. This has been a 12-year sort of process. It originally included some of my doctoral research, and thanks to the colleagues from the ETUI, I was able to get some good a good way into the Nordic trade union world. And then I should definitely say thanks to the colleagues at FEOS in Copenhagen, who received me not once but twice for several weeks as a guest researcher, and I was able to do 2 waves of field work, one in 2010 and one in 2021. This is sort of an extended case study, I would say. It's not really longitudinal, it's not quantitative, but it's a reflection of what's going on in the trade union world in the Nordic finance sector. So I'm using a little bit of the KIMT framework of T0, 1, and 2. T0 in the Nordic sort of trade union world is we got everything covered nationally, nice sector level collective bargaining. We have strong representation even at the company level, and this is true even in the finance sector, because that wouldn't necessarily be the case, for example, for Canadian financial organizations, just to put that into perspective. Then T1, what happens? Common European financial market happens, European financial crisis, Eurozone, all kinds of things happen. The Nordic banks were doing just fine, except Iceland. But certainly the other Nordic financial institutions were doing fine, expanded rapidly into Eastern Europe, into other countries, UK, Ireland, Netherlands, and so on and so forth. So this is my T1 2010 field work, and then the T2 is there's sort of a retrenchment. The Nordic banks were at sometimes in the middle of some of the scandals, including some very high-level politicians in those different countries. One of the banks certainly is still working out the sort of legal issues afterwards, and there's been a retrenchment. They've pulled back from some of the markets. So the question in all this is, do trade unions represent workers in this sort of mix? Are they just sort of following the banks with some transnational strategies, and then, oh well, now we're pulling back and we're folding? And to which point do their transnational strategies institutionalize? So do they actually make them permanent and build coalitions that are then permanent fixtures? From the trade union alliance literature, there seem to be sort of 3 main factors or levels or types of factors that are usually being considered. One is the sort of national level institutional type literature. One is company-based, right? A global value chain. What type of multinational are we dealing with? And then there are more actor-centered type of variables that are usually considered: narratives, repertoires, identities. Little bit what we just heard from our colleagues from Dublin. So the kind of stuff that Hyman, for example, would have been talking about in terms of trade union identity. So, and then we have market integration, which is sort of the common ongoing thing. We have certain crises and shocks that are happening, and then we want to see whether there's still transnational trade union alliances coming out at the end. And I'm using the word transnational company clubs, which seems to be the particular form of institutionalized transnational trade union alliance that the Nordic finance unions have built. I won't get the time to go into a lot of detail here, but just to sort of unpack the Nordic conundrum around market integration, there's lots of domestic challenges going on at the same time, obviously structural change, cashless society. I really won't get into detail there, and they're ongoing. There's really not much difference between T1 and T2 in those cases. But in terms of the sort of EU level challenges, there's been a little bit of a difference between the two time frames. So the banks are setting up shop elsewhere in Europe, including in places where there's a lot less union representation. Think of Poland, for example, Baltic countries. We have jobs created in those countries that are sometimes displacing, delocalizing headquarters employment, IT, accounting, more and more also legal professions. This is actually linked to sector level regulation, the first challenge, which is that the EU is trying to rein in on those banks being liberalized in the 2000s and now need to do a lot more work on compliance. And a lot of those jobs, ironically, were then created in places where, where this traditional Nordic framework doesn't apply. The Nordic banks figured they were a bit too small, so they could either try to increase in size or take over, and that's usually what they did. So they bought banks in different places or merged different Nordic banks together. And then there's the whole EU posting of workers, cross-posting within the banks of specialized managers, by the way, also that in the Nordic banks, it's very traditional that sort of you manage, try to manage as if you were in the Nordic countries and you sent them to Lithuania and try to, work with the union and the works council to work it out. Oh, good luck. But also more and more people coming into the Nordic countries, right? As there's a labor shortage as everywhere. Sort of strategic considerations for the trade unions. So two different forms of transnational alliances that were sort of created. One is a more on the policy level, more of a coordination on the policy level between the sectoral trade unions. They're part of Europe, but they've set up their own lobbying office, their own organization called the Nordic Finance Union, headquartered in Stockholm, but with an office in Brussels. And then there's these transnational company trade union clubs, which I will spend most of my time talking about. And then you have conflicts between the different levels, right? So you could imagine these trade unions being sort of torn between, well, we don't want all this Europe stuff. We're going to concentrate on convincing our own governments back home to not do too much of this European level stuff. So the posting of worker things, Laval, there's various cases that were quite high profile in the Nordic trade union world. Versus, no, we actually have to go to Europe and make sure that we intervene before this stuff comes back to us. Then on the company level, obviously you have two different potential conflicts. One is I got good relationships with my managers in Stockholm or Helsinki or wherever it might be, and I want to be, getting the best deal for myself, and then the other European colleagues are sort of left to dry, but also the companies obviously that figure, oh, well, great, we can sort of leverage one against the other, bit of whipsawing, and all of a sudden we're losing all kinds of jobs in the sort of headquarters in the Nordic countries. And then there's also, and this is sort of inside baseball to the Nordic countries, there's also just a potential conflict between making deals at the company level to begin with and having these strong sector level agreements. This is less of an issue in Denmark, where it's already a lot more decentralized. In Sweden, this is still a little bit more of an issue, but that's really inside sort of the Nordics. These are the three cases that I settled with. They're three ideal types, if one will. One I'm calling the United Nordic Bank, one the Expanded Nordic Bank, and one the Traditional Nordic Bank. And you can see, there's a slight difference in size here as well, but you can also see that their expansion and retrenchment is different. So the first two cases went into 12 different European countries and then sort of went back down from there. The Traditional Nordic Bank grew a little bit over a longer period of time and into less, a smaller number of companies. EWC is obviously mandatory in this context, but United Nordic Bank really goes a little bit beyond that. They're Societas Européennes, I have no idea how to pronounce that, but anyhow, European Société Européenne, and they have a sort of they require everything that's required of them in terms of the EWC directive. They do it, but they have a whole bunch of consultative committees, essentially, where they go beyond what is actually required in terms of consultation. They actually do discuss agreements and agree on various subjects, on a variety of subjects based on these consultative committees. So I would say it's EWC plus. In the expanded Nordic Bank, we do the EWC. We also have this trade union club only on the trade union side, and sporadically we'll agree with the company on some transnational agreements. And then you have the traditional Nordic Bank that just sort of complies with the EWC type consultative framework, informal discussions among the unions, often using the EWC meetings in order to see each other, but that's just about where it stops here. Now, one of the interesting elements is the board representation. As you may know, at least for Swedish labor law, I'm not quite sure about Finnish labor law. I believe in Germany that's the case as well. So you have some board of directors level representation for trade unions. And in the case of United Nordic Bank, they shared it. They said, okay, well, we got colleagues now from other countries, and we're going to name some Finnish colleague to the board of directors, although it's Swedish labor law, and so on and so forth. They also integrated the unions. So in the first and the second case, they actually created an organization called Unions in UNB, and unions, ENB's unions. So they rebranded themselves as a company union, as a transnational company union, and in many cases got some resources from the national sector finance unions in terms of consultants, in terms of organizing meetings, in terms of accompanying them, in terms of what can be discussed with management on a transnational basis and what's off limits because it's in the national sector level agreements. So in terms of the 5 different stimuli, if you will, from the European integration, this is sort of the picture. The Nordic company clubs really at the center of the response, I would say, to at least 4 of these different stimuli, and they're still there. They've gone through iterations of 10 countries, 8 countries, 12 countries, 5 countries, but they're there. They're institutionalized. They're making use of all kinds of resources as well that they get either from EU funding, from the management sometimes, or from their national sector level trade unions. What seems to have been a little bit less of a success is the sort of trying to export micro company level corporatism to other countries. There's been some problems with that, and especially in countries where the management went into the Baltics, for example, and played Wild West, and the compliance wasn't really there. So it was really hard to build any sort of similar structures there. And the organizing didn't work. So they poured a lot of resources into, for example, trying to increase the number of members in the Polish affiliate. And at 2010, there were at about 50 members out of a workforce of 2,000 in one of the companies involved. And in 2021, they had sort of stopped doing it, and they were still around somewhere 50, 60, 80 members, whatever it is. So out of a workforce of 3,000 in Poland at that point. So organizing doesn't seem to have worked. And then you have the sector level regulation where you have this NFU strategy, which is not a company-based strategy, but which is more of a policy level coordination between trade unions. NFU also plays a role, though, in trying to train and exchange best practices between the company clubs. So it's not completely unrelated here. Takeaways from all this. So I mean, for Nordic organizations that have, we always talk about comparative institutional advantage in the sort of diversity of capitalism literature. I mean, Nordic trade unions don't have that much to gain from transnationalize their strategies. They could just sort of back off and go back into their national front, defend it as much as they can. And in some sectors, that's what they actually mostly do. I mean, to be honest, the finance sector might be a little bit different here. So they've done it. They've made a priority out of it, and they've institutionalized it. It's there to stay, and it seems to weather all kinds of expansions and retrenchments. Sorry. So my argument on a theory level is you can't really argue that this is all about institutions. There's some form of experimentation going on by the actors themselves, and they make use of resources, be they borrowed from the EU, be they borrowed from the employer, in order to create these transnational company clubs. The other element is it's non-linear, right? It's not sort of, oh yes, we're doing more and more of all of the things we've started, so it's just market integration pushing us to do more, kind of spillover argument. That doesn't seem to be true, because some of the strategies they've pulled back on, others they have reinforced, etc. So that's also an argument, I believe, for institutional experimentation. And then you have, I mean, the same framework with very similar banks, and you have degrees and quite varying degrees to the development. And I won't have time to go into all of the examples thereof, but there really seems to be an argument here for actor-centered explanations. In some of the cases, it's language-based. So the earlier you got the Finnish colleagues in, the earlier you have to switch to English, for example. That's just a sort of one basic example. But there's many, many other sort of examples, I would say, of this sort of leadership actor-based element. And the very last comment, maybe, it does seem to be that the Nordic sort of common identity is driving this. So the 4 Nordic countries involved, that's always sort of the core, and then they try to organize this for people beyond the Nordics. And that's it. Thank you very much.